Well, thank you very much. We're here with Mr. Shivshankar Menon to discuss the bilateral relationship between India and the US. Let me just start off by asking you, it's been a little bit over a year since the new South Asia policy was announced by President Trump. What are the main aspects of that policy that you think were relevant, changed the dynamics in the bilateral relationship, US-India? And where do you think that dynamic is going? Has it been a radical break from the previous relationship and the previous policy? And where do you see it heading?
Well, it's interesting that you ask if it was a break, because if you think of it, every administration since the Clinton administration has actually invested very heavily in transforming this relationship. And that's equally true on the Indian side. It's been a bipartisan effort in both countries. In India since NDA 1, since Mr. Vajpayee's government. And part of the reason I think why India-US relations have come so far is because of that, because both sides have made this continuous investment, and this is why Congress has been supportive throughout. We managed to do things like the Civil Nuclear Agreement and so on, which otherwise, I don't think people would have predicted that when the process started. So I'm not sure that the Trump administration's South Asia policy represents a very fundamental change in approach. No. Every administration wants to. We're democracies. We know this. This happens in India too. Every administration wants to say, I'm new and better than anybody else. But that's part of the process of democratic differentiation that leaders have to do. But I think it's still a little too early to say what that policy, which at least it expresses a tremendous commitment to South Asia, to the relationship with India, to particularly the maritime, the Indo-Pacific, to the maritime aspects of policy of security in the entire region. But I think it's still a little too early to say what it actually means. We're watching it being implemented in practice. In practice, what we see is a much stronger emphasis on reciprocity and I would say even transactionalism in the economic and trade side of the relationship than we've seen in other recent US administrations. But we've also seen a willingness on the defense, security, intelligence side to actually work much more closely together. And that's been a steady process which has grown. I think some of it is because of the congruence that's very basic to the relationship. There is a political and strategic congruence as we see the world changing around us on both sides. But I think we still have to see how that policy actually plays out in practice, how much the US is willing to commit in terms of treasure, in terms of money to implementing parts of it. There are things that I think the US today is very keen on, like a bilateral free trade agreement, for instance. But that's part of a larger process of the US bilateralizing her trading arrangements and moving away from the multilateral system, from the WTO system. I think we're ready to discuss it, have been for some time, but the devil is in the details. We have to see what the terms of that arrangement will be like, and I'm not sure that that's going to be a very easy negotiation. So we've got to a stage where it's interesting. When we started the transformation, I think we all thought that the politics would be difficult, that the strategic parts of the relationship would be difficult, but the economic congruence and complementarity was so obvious. Here's a country which, if you look at the two economies and their levels of development, the US has technology, has capital, has all the things that India lacks. India has the people, and is developing the skills, has the market. So there was a natural economic fit, which we thought would. Now today it's actually the economic issues that are proving much more contentious and much I think will need much more attention. than the politics and the strategy, which are going well.
Well, let's turn maybe then to the area where we have seen quite a bit of movement of late, and that's security. Given also your background understanding there, bilateral cooperation between both countries in the security field has increased. We had the 2+2 talks recently, a bunch of agreements that were signed, Comcasa in particular. Where do you see the bilateral relationship heading in terms of traditional security issues?
Well, the direct bilateral defense relationship is booming. As you said, 2 of the foundational agreements have recently been signed, or relatively recently, both for the logistic support and for communications interoperability, so that our forces can actually talk to each other, can work together. Defense sales from the US to India have also grown considerably. India's status as a defense partner now is equal to that of significant allies of the US, and that's been done by the Trump administration. So there's a whole set of things that have been done to smoothen that bilateral defense relationship. Also, the levels of consultation and cooperation are much higher than before. You mentioned the 2+2, but more than that, Indian armed forces officers will be with, well, CENTCOM, with PACOM, or Indo-Pacific Command, I suppose it's called now. So I think that relationship is going very well. I think what needs more work perhaps is a larger sense of how the strategic congruence that we see in this body of water called the Indo-Pacific, all the way from the Indian Ocean through the seas near China to the Western Pacific, how that is actually going to play out in terms of security approaches, not just traditional security, hard security issues, but even simple things like humanitarian disaster relief, what we do. You've seen the tsunami recently, Sulawesi. How do we respond to things like that? What do we do about fisheries? And of course, the more important things for both of us, major trading nations, how do we ensure that there's freedom of navigation on the high seas? That, I think, and that it stays secure. We have, over the last 2 decades, developed considerable experience of working together, not just bilaterally, but with other countries, whether it was the elimination of piracy off the Malacca Straits, and where Singapore played a huge role in coordinating efforts and in making sure that we continue that work together. And I think that's where we need to go, to make sure that India, the US, but also Singapore, Indonesia, other countries along this body of water also share an interest and actually work together in ensuring security in this area. I think that's probably an area where there are other new security agenda issues which I think we'll also need to start thinking of seriously, whether it's cyber. There are issues like that which I think outer space and security, all the commons basically are now contested. And I think that's a new situation, and I think we need to find some way of dealing with that.
So the broad brush of security working together in the Indo-Pacific seems to be that there's quite a convergence of interests between...
I think the details still need to be considerably, and we need to... I think it's clear there's strategic congruence at a high level. There's also a lot of bilateral comfort because we have experience of working together. But what goes in between is still very unclear. And I'm not sure we've worked that out for ourselves, that either of us are clear, quite frankly. Part of it is because the situation is changing so quickly. If you look at the balance of power in the region, it's shifting almost every day. And this is a complicated region. I mean, if you look at sort of this, what we call the Indo-Pacific, which for India extends all the way from the west coast of Africa to from the east coast of Africa to the west coast of America. So if you look at that, there's several powers who are rising. And if you look at the accretion of hard power, you look at just the acquisition of weapons in the region and the growth in defense budgets. it's quite impressive. And it's not just China, it's also, South Korea, Japan, Indonesia, India, all. And these are maritime powers. China's trying to make that transition for the first time in her history. And they are rubbing up against each other. You see this in the South China Sea, but you see it in various ways. So it's time actually that we sat down together and involve them all in this process. All of them. Because if you don't do that, it's not going to work. But because it's changing so fast, it's not good enough to say stability. Strategic stability is our goal, because it's an unstable situation. There's no point, putting your finger in the dike and saying, I want stability, when the water's pouring in all around you. So I think that's where you need much closer consultation and understanding actually of the strategic situation, and among many more people than just India and the US. But I think India-US relations can be the seed which actually starts something. I'm not saying build a huge security architecture, because an architecture is rigid. But you need to put in place the habits of cooperation, of working together, of dealing with issues, of crisis management, of things that work in practice.
What about looking at traditional security issues closer to India's borders, Pakistan?
Yeah.
There seems to be, compared at least to the previous administration on both sides, the US as well as India, there seems to be a greater convergence with regard to how Pakistan is viewed. The new South Asia policy that the Trump administration articulated has put Pakistan much more on notice. Most recently, they canceled $300 million in aid. Where do you see, it's one thing to broadly agree, it's another to closely cooperate, and then the question of what that means in terms of where Pakistan heads. Any thoughts there?
Well, I think there's much less patience or willingness either in the US or in India to cut Pakistan slack and to allow Pakistan to go on doing what it has been doing in terms of supporting cross-border terrorism and in terms of essentially meddling in Afghanistan. And so these are things where I think, yes, the world put up with a fair amount of it for a long time, but I think that patience has run dry. That might be true of the US and India, but it's not necessarily true of everybody else in the region. And so what we see, therefore, is an attempt by Pakistan to try and compensate for that by looking for other sources of support. And when it comes to listing Masood Azhar, for instance, as a terrorist, he's Pakistan-based, supported by Pakistan. You saw a Pakistani minister appearing with Hafiz Saeed, the head of LET, yesterday. He said at the Prime Minister's orders. So I don't see Pakistan changing her ways yet. I don't think that international pressure, whether it's putting them in the grey zone in the FATF, watching terrorist financing out of Pakistan and in Pakistan, I don't think that the pressure has reached that stage yet. Let's see where this goes. It's true, I think there is much less patience with what Pakistan has been doing, but I'm not sure, I wouldn't say, oh yeah, now things are going to change, everything's changed all over again. Because if you look at the recent vote in Pakistan, unfortunately, if you look at the more extreme, radical, some, in fact, jihadi elements who put up political fronts and fought in the election, they did very well. Maybe not the traditional religious parties didn't do as well as they thought they might, but the others did. And the new ruling party also contains several people of some, well, I suppose the only word is ambiguous persuasions.
Yes. What about, the bilateral relationship and its convergence on Pakistan has direct implications for Pakistan's other neighbor, Afghanistan. And there, one of the clear pushes by the Trump administration, or focus has been on, request has been on asking India to do more in Afghanistan. In general terms, that has been the push. Now, the specifics, we haven't really seen India doing more. In fact, from last year to this, lending to India in terms of
To
grants given
Afghanistan,
to Afghanistan have gone down.
It's gone down.
And so this question of India is quite happy that the US is saying do more in Afghanistan because they actually have quite a convergence of interests in Afghanistan. The question is, what is India willing to do more
Well, I
of?
think what we do in Afghanistan is determined by the Afghans, by the Afghan government.
But they've been
And
asking for
now-
a while for India
and
to
we've
do more.
been, but I think so far what we have worked out with the Afghans is that we work very closely together on their development needs, including whether it's small development projects, whether it's power lines, whether it's actually generating electricity, Salma Dam. I mean, there's a whole series, and they're the ones who chose. They wanted a new parliament building. We built that. There's a whole list of things that we've done. And we've spent, well, now close to $3 billion so far, if you add it up over time since 2001. But I'm not sure whether when the present US administration says India should do more, whether they mean India should get involved in Afghan politics, which we've always tried very hard not to, because we don't think that's our function. We think it's for the Afghans to actually decide where they go with their own politics. There is a so-called peace process with the Taliban, which we are never quite sure where the lines are. I mean, when you talk to the US, you get one set of red lines which will not be crossed. You talk to the UK, you get a different set. Talk to the Pakistanis, there are no red lines, I think. So it's, this is a very fluid situation. We, I think, as I said, primary determinant of what we do will be the Afghans. Also India's interest.
Security cooperation?
We have cooperated with the Afghans, and we've cooperated in ways that they are comfortable with, whether it's training their armed forces and their security personnel, whether it's working together in other things. But again, that's ultimately, there is also such a thing as an Afghan capacity to carry and to bear these things. It's not as though you can just walk in tomorrow with $3 billion and say, okay, let's spend this money. There is a capacity issue there. So I think those are the things that will determine what India does. For me, there is still something of a question mark about where the US intends to go in Afghanistan. And so let's see. I think this is still fluid.
What about, you mentioned cybersecurity, humanitarian, non-traditional security issues have are increasingly starting to be seen as directly posing a threat. I mean, whether it's, the movement of people, humanitarian crisis, or climate change, or cybersecurity, increasingly that can directly pose a threat to India's security. And we've seen, as you mentioned, quite a bit of, increasing bilateral engagement on traditional security issues. What about sticking points such as the Rohingya crisis in the neighborhood, or the larger question of, is India willing to get involved in peacekeeping operations from, be it Syria to, as a rising power, those kind of questions will come up more and more.
Well, to deal with non-traditional, I think this US administration has pulled back from various multilateral ways of dealing with non-traditional threats, whether it's climate change, they've abandoned the Paris Accords. Even on cybersecurity and so on, there were attempts under the previous US administration to try and see whether we couldn't work out codes of behavior, at least rules of the road internationally, even though there were obviously states like Russia, China, who had very different views, who sought really to impose national sovereignty in what is a completely open cyberspace. But there were attempts, but the US seems to have pulled back from that. Most of these non-traditional issues, therefore, today between India and the US will be dealt with bilaterally, because the US is just not participating in multilateral processes that deal with that. That, I think, is a loss, because it's actually, you know, one string to our bow that we've just chosen not to use. Because the US has tremendous, not just hard power, but tremendous soft power as well, and especially in areas like this, where she can show the way she has technological leadership as well, and you know, but that's just a fact of life, and I think we live with that. About India's role in issues like the Rohingyas, and yes, I think one could argue that, you know, say West Asia, for instance, where clearly, you know, security is an issue, we have huge interests. We have 7 million Indians who live and work in the Gulf and Saudi. We get, what, 63 billion tons of crude oil from there. And remittances.
Yeah.
So if you think of it, it's clearly an Indian interest. So far, what we've done is work with all the regional powers, whether it's Saudi Arabia, Iran, Israel, Egypt. We work with whoever it is. And we have managed to do that. I think we're probably the only power who have managed to do that consistently for 70 years now. And we've done that by staying out of their internal affairs, by drawing a very clear line between what is security and what is being a bodyguard to the regimes, or to getting involved in regime stability operations of any kind. And I think that's a very important line to draw. I think India would and has in the past participated in peacekeeping where it's at the request of the legitimate government and where it's an international effort. But there has to be a peace to keep. You know, it's no good just sending in troops to do what is primarily in all these cases. You mentioned Rohingyas, it's not a military problem. It's a political and social problem which needs to be dealt with accordingly. And it needs a mobilization of political effort. The problem with today's world is that, frankly, we've over-militarized security. I mean, well, if you have a hammer, I suppose every problem looks like a nail. But these are not issues that sending in the military is going to solve. I mean, Syria is a good example of there not being a military solution to what is primarily a political problem and an internal order problem and an internal problem of the distribution of power in a society where there are several very powerful minorities, which is ethnically divided. And I don't see these as being amenable to military solutions. I think there's a risk here, where because you have a military, because you're a bigger power, and so you think, I'll solve these problems militarily. And that, I'm afraid, is not how it works. So I think the basic principle that we've followed so far, that at the request of the legitimate government, that it has to have international legitimacy and sanction, that I think makes sense. And that you have to look at the nature of the problem. On the Rohingya issue, I think we should be much more involved politically, because it's primarily a political problem between two countries who are friends of India and who are very important to our security, friends that matter. And I think we should help them to try and solve that problem, but solve it in a humanitarian way, in a political way. And I'm not sure peacekeeping is the right word, because there's no peace to keep there, by the way.
India as a rising power. There's the hard power element, the hammer, as you mentioned, but there's also the soft power element. And I think being seen as a power that has both, that is willing to, for the larger good, not just for its own interests, become involved in keeping the peace in the region, in ensuring that there's freedom of navigation in its neighborhood, but also beyond, is an Indian interest, but it's also depending on how India goes about helping Vietnam's claims in the South China Sea, for example. Depending on how India engages beyond its own self-interest in its neighborhood and beyond, that will rely to some degree on how it marshals its soft power. So India rising One area where we see this is sort of the navigation of India at multilateral institutions, and where it might actually be perhaps at loggerheads with the current U.S. administration, be it the UN Security Council in India has been keen to get a seat, which the U.S. has been supportive of, but the Trump administration has a much more difficult relationship, shall we say, with the UN, or the World Bank, or WTO. How do you see the bilateral relationship, India being able to gain from the bilateral relationship at a time when the US is not as interested in multilateralism?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there has to be a clear hierarchy of interests. You might want all kinds of things, but not everything is going to be possible at the same time. And I think you need to decide what's more important to you at a particular time. Today, it might be very good for your ego to hear that India is rising and you need to play a big role, and it's flattering, but it's irrelevant to your real needs. You still have far too many domestic concerns about transforming India. You have far too many people who are hungry, who are illiterate. You need to develop the country first. And I think that's where India needs to concentrate. Much like the US did right through the 19th century, and until she was dragged kicking and screaming into 2 world wars and into building a world order. But not very happily, at no stage. I remember, who was it, Averell Harriman, who said in 1946 that all that the American people want is for us to settle everything with the Russians and to go back to drinking Coke and watching movies, I think. So the other side, the flip side of a rising power is not getting involved in other people's fights. What George Washington said in his farewell address. And I think that's good advice to any rising power. So it might not be very satisfying to the ego, it might not, and other people will keep accusing you of not being a responsible power. Exactly as the US was accused, right through the late 19th, early 20th century, until after 45, when it stopped. But for half the 20th century, the US was being accused of being irresponsible and not playing her necessary role. And, so the temptations are always there. But I think primarily, we have to keep our eye on what's important. And what's important is transforming India. What helps the transformation of India is the most important. What doesn't is peripheral and irrelevant. Membership in the Security Council, the rest of these multilateral organizations, that will come if you actually transform India. If you make India into a prosperous, modern, powerful country where every citizen can achieve his or her full potential, then all that will follow. That's secondary, and it's much lower in my order of business to doing what Gandhiji said, which is wiping the tear from the eye of every Indian. That's much more important.
Let me turn to the China factor. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, especially given your background and your understanding of China. Some have said that the US is building an anti-China coalition, especially in light of the trade wars and the bilateral Chinese-US relationship, and that the US is trying to rein and pull in India into this larger effort. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there are plenty of paranoid Chinese who think so. But I don't see it happening. There's a fundamental difference, I think, between what China-US relations and, say, US-Soviet relations, which is the economic interdependence between the two, which is why they can fight a tariff war. If they were like the US and Soviet Union were, they wouldn't be fighting a tariff war, and it wouldn't matter to both of them. But these are two economies which are codependent in a sense. Their prosperity depends on neither of them can afford to drive the other to their knees. So yes, there's a tariff war that's begun, but both have been careful to keep it limited to tariffs, not even to the rest of trade. forget about finance or to the other economic aspects of their relationship. So I wouldn't immediately jump to the conclusion that, oh, we're in a new US-China Cold War and the US is going to organize the equivalents of NATO, SEATO, and a whole set of allies and pacts. I don't see that happening. Both India and the US have very important relationships with China and want to manage that relationship. But these are very complicated relationships. In our case, our relationship with China, it involves some competition. It also involves a lot of cooperation. They're our biggest trading partner in goods. If you add services, it's the US. But there are things we do together. There's no question. We have a huge disputed boundary with China. It's the world's biggest boundary dispute. But it's also the most peaceful border we have, even if it's the least undefined. So, and that's because we work together at it. We have a common interest in that. It seems to me there are other common interests as well. I mean, these are the world's largest trading nations, China and the US. They should have a common interest in freedom of navigation in the high seas. We need to come to some kind of accommodation on that, which is important to all of us, for India as well. So, to just call it an anti-China coalition and containing China, I think misses the much more complex reality that we face. Now, it's going to be difficult because it's, there will be, every once in a while, there will be a rumpus or a ruckus. And, what you're seeing now in the trade war is serious. It has consequences for a whole lot of countries. And for the international system as a whole. And the system itself is being reset. If you look at the growth of regional free trade agreements, RCPs being negotiated, TPP, the US might have pulled out, but the others are trying to go ahead with it. You are actually watching a process not just of double deglobalization in a sense. People are onshoring production back. The proportion value added in China on the various global production chains has gone up. Same in the US. I mean, the amount of production that's being onshored back to the US has also gone up in the last few years. And there's a regional fragmentation. So you're getting two kinds of deglobalization going on at the same time. But that's not the whole story. It's still a global economy. And for countries like India, that's important. I think it's important for the US as well, even though the US might not be happy with the way it was. You saw how US, Canada, and Mexico have renegotiated NAFTA, given it a new name. Let's see what the details are. But essentially, we all need that trade. We all need that global economy. So, and there's no way that I think that can then break down into a US-China Cold War or US containment of China. China, India, countries like this are too big to be contained. It's been tried before and failed at much lower levels of power. So, I don't think that's really a very good frame in which to understand what we're seeing today.
Turning to sort of the long view, your thoughts. You've been in government, have served India for several decades, have been abroad, so sort of been outside looking at India, but from within also. And you've studied and been a practitioner who has contributed to closer bilateral relations amongst these two countries. The relationship has been through ups and downs, and yet when you sort of look back over the last few decades and then turn to looking forwards, what is your long view of the bilateral relationship?
Well, I'm a long-term optimist about this relationship. Not because of the political congruence or even the economic complementarity, but more because both countries are actually founded on very similar values. They're plural, they're open, they believe in things that they haven't achieved. Both of them. I mean, they've written constitutions which are really beautiful works of art. There's a natural chemistry between the people which works. I mean, when somebody sells real estate in Gurgaon and calls it Palm Springs in order to sell you a flat, you know what his aspirations are. I mean, for the Indian middle class, There is a natural affinity there. So when Vajpayee said we're natural allies, I think he actually touched a chord somewhere. And if you look at the Indian American community, for instance, as a link between the two, they've served a huge purpose in the transformation, as we saw when we did civil nuclear. They really did pull their weight, but they also had influence, but they were willing to use it. But they're not a controversial community in the sense that some other communities have been. And they've assimilated. And I think it's that openness of mind, that set of values that ultimately will see it through. And because we can argue, because we can differ, because we build our societies on the idea of dissent being legitimate, we can cope with differences. And we can actually survive pretty, some, our interests won't always coincide. We are very different, at very different levels of development. We're geographically located very differently. There are things that matter to us, which, we're a continental power. For us, the continental order in Eurasia matters maybe much more than it does to the US immediately. Today, what happens in Central Asia, for instance, affects us directly. Maybe not so much for the US. But even so, because of this fundamental, this basic similarity, if you look at the Indian Constitution, a lot of it actually Ambedkar drew from the US. The idea of checks and balances, of an independent judiciary, the Bill of Rights. You look at, it's really quite, and he acknowledges his debt right through. So I think, for me, that's what will see this relationship through. If we lose that, either of us, start being intolerant of dissent, start being unable to actually argue our case, use reason, apply logic to the cases that we have, and to cut each other some slack, then I think we're in trouble. But I think we're a long way away from that. We are fundamentally tolerant and open societies, and that I think will see us through.
Oh no, that's a lovely positive note to wrap up. Thank you so very much for your thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks.